Hi, this is Rabbi Rami Goldberg, and welcome to Biblical Money, powered by Israel 365, where we take a deep dive into how people of faith enhance their business by staying true to their biblical principles. We interview leading CEOs, executives, and entrepreneurs to capture their wisdom to help us live our most fulfilled and faithful lives. Please like and subscribe to the channel to stay up to date and informed. Welcome back to Biblical Money. I am Rabbi Rami Goldberg. And we take these conversations and we explore with a whole host of different people, the Bible and business, faith and finance. And I'm here today with Pastor Jeff Ward, who's not wearing his pastor hat today or these days, right? He's gone into law. He is an author, a pastor, a lawyer. Are you a rabbi also? Throw that in there. Anyway, welcome aboard. Looking forward to getting you on. I know you literally have written the book on this, and we definitely share a heart for business and faith. So let's jump in. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're up to and where you've come from.
Yeah. Thanks, Rainey. Boy, that was quite an introduction. You said it just the way I wrote it. Also, husband and dad are kind of the best titles for me these days. And so, I grew up kind of in Oklahoma and knew pretty early. I grew up in the church, so grew up in a ministry family, but knew pretty quickly I was going to go the law school route. So went to law school, moved back to Dallas where we had some family and friends and where the jobs were, frankly, and did the big law firm track for just under 7 years and did litigation there. Great experience, not a lot of work-life balance, and also just questions related to, as I kind of progressed in that field, kind of understanding, hey, what does it mean to be a person of faith and a lawyer and all of those kinds of questions. And then had the opportunity to leave that firm and start a new firm with a law partner of mine and our managing partner from our Houston office. So we left, started our own firm in a city called Addison, just north of Dallas proper, and did that for another almost 7 years and loved it, loved those law partners, loved the practice of law. But really, again, the questions came with me into that context. And so ultimately transitioned from that firm to work on staff at our church, where I've been on staff for over 16 years, kind of doing a mix of outreach, missions, legal work, and that kind of thing. And then just recently, as you know, transitioned back into the marketplace as the COO for a law firm and some good friends that I've partnered with for years. So, I'm all of 2 months into a new role. So that's a lot, I know.
So I think the thing I'd like to jump into, because a lot of people have the not unidirectional, but they start off in some sort of business, and they're like in some sort of business role, and at some point they might make a lot of money, and they're like, okay, now I got to go dedicate myself, nonprofit ministry. Let me get out of the business world. And you got out. And then you said, I'm not done yet. I'm going to get back in the business. Well, like, what was that? Kind of. I know you're transitioning, as it were. But what pushed you to that decision? Was pastoral life so bad? Was it what pushed you? What pushed you out, and or not pushed you out, or pulled you in? Like, why that transition?
It's good. So, again, growing up in kind of a ministry family, I remember even my wife, as we were teenagers and we were dating, she said, "Do you think you'll ever work for the church?" And I said, "No, not ever, never." And it's so funny.
She's like, good. I want to know that there's bread on the table, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And what's interesting about that is I never say never anymore. God has a funny sense of humor. He tends to take me up on those things, when I say those things. But I'd say this, I think, over the course of the last 30 years, there's been this kind of question, I think, in me of what does it mean to be a Christian and lawyer? And this whole idea of the integration of faith and work, until really just in the last few years going, no, actually, when you say integration of faith and work, that's really a misnomer, because as people of faith, we are first and foremost people of faith, and then we work, right? And we integrate work into our faith. And so even as you talk about nonprofit work, church work, or secular marketplace work, I don't see those distinctions as much anymore. As I read scripture, it's more of we're all in vocational ministry, right? Like God worked, He gave us ability and the blessing of work, and He calls us to cultivate. And so whether that's a lawyer or an educator or a healthcare practitioner or a rabbi or a janitor, right? We are all on mission, cultivating and carrying out our Imago Dei, right? Our image of God that we're created to reflect.
Yeah, I remember one year, it was the high holidays, which we just went through. I don't know when this episode will be released, but we just went through, and I remember thinking like of God as CEO, so to speak, and like, how does it work when you have a company that you, as you do more and do better within a company, the CEO promotes you and he finds new roles and new opportunities, and kind of had that kind of image of of God in that regard. But I think, as you've said, we a lot of times we think of them as kind of two bifurcated life. I come to church or synagogue, and then I go out to the workforce, and have minimal interaction between those two.
Yeah, that's right.
You transition back to law, but it's not. You see things as kind of very fluid because it's all just working for the boss ultimately within your work. So, what type of law do you practice, and like what are some of the challenges? Obviously, when they, the old joke, how do you know when a lawyer is lying? Is like when he opens his mouth, right? So, how do you deal with some of those challenges that they that
Man,
come up?
it's early in the morning for the law jokes, but no,
Okay.
I
Well, not here. I'm in Israel, right? We're already late, right? So.
No, that's right. That's right. No, I think, the thing for me, it is fluid. But I think we have a challenge in the church. I can't speak for the Jewish community and what is being, the message that's communicated there. But I think sometimes in the church, we've done a good job around helping people in the marketplace understand ethics. How we do our work really, really matters. Excellence. If you go to Colossians 3 in the New Testament, it talks about working as unto the Lord. And so this idea of excellence, ethics, just how to have conversations with people who might be hurting, those kinds of things, relationship. But I think beyond that, what I always wrestled with is, does God care what kind of work I do? Does he want me to love and serve my neighbor or my community through my vocation? And, how do I carry over the biblical principles that we learn, around biblical conflict resolution? Or, how to treat subordinates, right? Employees, or how to treat bosses, or how to handle the discouragement, right? That, we talked about even before when we talked about work being before the curse in the garden, right? And yet there was the curse, and we're called to still cultivate, but now we're dealing with thorns and thistles, and weeds. And so we know that discouragement and frustration is part of work. Work is not the curse, but it's under the curse. And so how do we as people of faith handle that when that comes? And so, I think for me, regardless of the kind of work that we're doing, whether it's law or operations or any of the other ones that I mentioned or any other, it's understanding how am I called to cultivate, really, which is the Lord's command, right, in Genesis 2, when he creates the orchard and he puts man into it to cultivate it. What does cultivation look like in my vocation? And also, what does that mean is as people of faith, how are we called to change, and redeem parts of our vocation that might be broken? So, that could be, I think I mentioned to you in the pre-interview, just our financial services, system here in Dallas being broken somewhat for under-resourced, people who use payday lending, for example, which are micro loans, but at high interest that keeps them in a cycle of dependence and debt, and going, hey, as people of faith, what can we do about this to restore, redeem, and fix this brokenness? And so it's really a bigger theology of work for me, and impact, and understanding identity. The other problem we have here in Dallas is that we tend to, work as an expression of our identity, but it's not the source of it. And so in this kind of hard charging business culture that is Dallas, it's really easy for us to find our identity there instead of, as people of faith in the Lord. And so that's important. And then, just again, how do we love and serve people through our vocation?
Yeah. Well, we actually just read the book of Jonah on Yom Kippur, which we just went through. And it's interesting because the sailors turn to Jonah and they say, what do you do? And he says, Ivri Anochi, I am an Ivri, I'm a Hebrew. And he identifies with his faith. And that's sometimes, our first entry into our conversation is, what do you do? Now, there's something there could be a big blessing within that, because by me knowing what you do, we can then ultimately help each other out. And I do think there's a lot of value. You actually look, Rabbi Daniel Lapin points this out, that many Jewish last names are based on a person's profession, because it was, that was your business card, so to speak, goldsmith or silversmith, so any of these types of Wasserman meant a water carrier, so he was the water guy. So all of these different types of, jobs. So there is definitely a value, but as you said, if it's the thing that defines you the most, it's certainly going to be problematic that it's like, okay, this is what I do, as opposed to, no, I have like a higher calling. And whether within that calling I am asked to serve as a janitor or I'm asked to serve as a CEO, they really have the same mission ultimately, and that's to bring God consciousness down into this world. So I'm curious, within your pastoral days, or which is somewhat continuing, but did you have people come to you? Like, what are some of the projects that you worked on within the business world and kind of pulling these two areas together?
Yeah, that's so great. So I think a lot of times it's, at least for the church, again, what we tend to do with folks in the marketplace is say, well, if you want to serve, you can serve at our kids ministry, you can park cars, you can hand out bulletins, you can lead small groups. I mean, any number of things. All of those are good things. I think where we can do better is helping people be inspired inside their vocation to love and serve, right? Then there's all kinds of biblical examples of that we talked about, even going back to Exodus, right, where God calls certain people with certain skills to work on the tabernacle, right, or calls them inside their vocation. And so what I try to do, I get to have a lot of those conversations with people in the marketplace who go, man, I would love to serve in student or kids ministry, but I'm also a banker, or I'm in sales, or a doctor. And man, how can I use this particular skill set really to advance the kingdom in some really tangible ways? And so one of the things, because again, I'm in the legal industry, that we did a number of years ago is start kind of pulling together some people who were asking the same questions. And so, we as lawyers pulled together a group. First, it was called Watermark Justice. We're not very creative. We know that God has justice. We look at passages like Micah 6:8 and Psalms, and I think it's 61. Psalm 41:1. Blessed is the man who considers the poor, right? And then we look at the words like, I think it's avodah, which is the word for work, and how it's is threaded through Scripture as service and worship, and just going, hey, what does that mean for us as lawyers? Like, do we work harder to write a bigger check, to the church? Do we take pro bono cases, which are, doing legal services for free for the under-resourced folks? What does that look like? So we started doing some book studies. We started doing some Bible studies. We invited in people who were leading sort of faith-based legal organizations, like a group called International Justice Mission that works all over the world to combat injustice. And we're like, okay, we know God has a heart for this. We know we have access to the legal system. How do we marry those things? And so that group grew, because what we've learned is a lot of people were asking those kinds of questions. And at its heyday several years ago, there were probably 600 or 700 of us that started working with the DA's office here in Dallas to do expunction, events to help people with things on their criminal record that were preventing them from getting jobs and housing, things that that shouldn't be on there. But the DA's office couldn't remove them. They needed volunteer lawyers to do that. So we started doing that. We started working with some organizations here in Dallas that were using the legal system to shut down abandoned properties that were being used for drugs or brothels or things like that. We started working on those. We started doing some things overseas in areas where lawyers were really struggling in systems really built around corruption. So all of a sudden, we just had this vision for, hey, how do we in our profession start doing things like that? And then what happened is other people in other professions started asking the same questions. And so there were architects and design professionals that were, how do we build buildings for the glory of God? And so that group got going, and then healthcare practitioners, started asking those same questions. And so we ended up spinning up a nonprofit entity that provides healthcare here in Dallas. Another one that's a community development corporation, the Watermark CDC and Watermark Health. And so they're now, standalone urgent care clinics that are church-based, that are running to serve our community. And then also job creation and financial literacy and incentivized savings. So working with banks So it's really just requires, some inspiration and a little bit of invitation to give people some practical ways to jump in their vocation to love and serve others.
Yeah, I think that's so. There's so many of these things, and I don't know if we had talked about this, but when you do these things, would ultimately lead to a certain amount of prevention. It's very difficult because there's no reward. Meaning the guy's in I don't know, $50,000 worth of debt, and you come and you write some sort of big check. Wow, that is amazing. But what happens if you teach the person those skills of how to budget and how to resource and how to make sure that they're not overspending and buying the latest whatever the television tells us we should be buying, and which isn't going to be good for us from a monetary perspective. And look, this guy's not in he's not in debt 5 years, 10 years later. It's very difficult for us to have this sense of like, oh, look at what we accomplished. But those are all such great things to be able to teach. Do you do anything with the kind of teenagers and young professionals right out of the gate? Because I know we have a project here in the community for young married people to teach them about finances.
Yeah, that's good. Well, I'm telling you, like this younger generation, they are all about. And this is in the data too. There's a group called Gallup that does a bunch of surveys and data, and particularly that younger generation and Gen Z even and millennials. But what they're finding is that younger people in the marketplace, while compensation is important, it's much less important to them than it was even to my generation. And it's like, hey, we'll take a lower paying job if we feel like we're part of something bigger than ourselves, if we're being coached and developed and mentored, if there's an impact path, even more so than a career path. And so this younger generation is all about serving, their communities. In fact, I got to go, SMU, Southern Methodist University here in Dallas, has a Christian Legal Society, and I got to go, talk to this group there. And at the end of the talk, it was kind of Q&A time, and I was like, oh, I bet the questions are going to come about how do I get that blue chip law firm job, and how do I. And it wasn't really in a very encouraging way. The questions were more of how do I have impact? How do I use a legal degree and legal skills to serve others? And how do I help our city be a better place because I'm here, And so those are the kind of questions the younger generation is asking. And as employers in the marketplace, we've got to go, hey, how do we meet them where they are and integrate them, and then have a culture in our companies of where they do feel like they're part of something bigger, where they do feel like they're cultivating and co-creating, where they do feel like they're serving their neighbors. So it's a challenge for us as owners and employers.
Yeah. It's always so challenging because it's like, okay, what is the inspiration? I was in the legal consulting space, immigration law and patent law. So like kind of ancillary to some of the work that you're doing, but it's hard to talk about the inspiration of what you're doing, even though what you're doing is something very valuable to somebody else. I think that's also, there's a lot of literature on servant leadership. I don't know if you, which I've done some reading on, but the idea of serving and picking up those younger people as they come in, was always for me just a big pride that I was able to, to take someone who might not have come from the same pedigree and just said, okay, here's an opportunity and we're going to work on this on this together. But it's great that they, kind of you're seeing that within the younger generation. One thing I'm like curious in terms of, obviously the big discussion about church and state. We got to leave our faith at the door and we got to only talk in this room. We only talk about law. We only talk about business, whatever it is. Do you talk about God in the firm, and how is that received? You obviously you have a very close connection with the Jewish community. You have all different people, and you want to, on the one hand, be respectful. On the other hand, want to, as a Christian, you do want to share your faith. How do you kind of balance those two? And is that something that comes up, I would say regularly within your law firm experience?
Yeah, that's great. That's a great question. And, one thing I'd say is, and I want to talk about inside, the firm and the culture, but also just in the community. What has been so fun and what I so appreciate really about Israel 365 is just the bridge building between the Jewish community and the Christian community. Because whether it's mitzvah, right, or it's our desire to be salt and light, it's man, we want our city to be better because we're here. And so, what the beauty of this is that when you talk to city officials about things like joblessness, homelessness, trafficking, education disparities, like they kind of perk up and they're like, "Oh, you care about those things as the church?" And we're like, "Yeah, absolutely." Now, we're coming at it because of a motivation from our faith, right? But we want to tackle those same problems with you, with an army of people who want to use their skill sets to do that as well. So I think at least the church can be viewed as insular, as exclusive, as focused solely on what happens inside the four walls. And so we're trying to break down those barriers, not just at the Christian community, but the Jewish community as well. And it's been fun getting to work with the Jewish community here in Dallas around some of those issues that we get to tackle together. Now, inside, the firm, which is your question, it can look different, right, depending on the context. And so, I've got a friend who owns a bank and founded a bank. It's publicly traded, and so he's got shareholders upstream of him that he's accountable to, and at the same time, is informed by biblical principles around how should we view profit, how should we view debt, how do we treat our workers, right, in a way that it's also that Boaz principle that we talked about, right? Like just the ability to cultivate 100% of your field, whatever that field might be, but then saying, oh, no, I'm not going to cultivate all of that. I'm not going to harvest the entire field and then send 10% of that to the government to take care of the under-resourced folks. But how do I, in the context of my field, provide care for those who need it? And so, inside our firm, we have a culture. I mean, our character matters is our motto, and we've got some core values that really drive everything we do. Servant leadership and impact and, excellence and those kinds of values, which are biblical values, but they're values for any marketplace. And so, we're not overtly Christian in that sense, but we do drive a lot of our thinking back to our core values, which are biblical in nature.
Yeah. And sometimes people think that they don't recognize that the biblical principles are the best way to run your business. And by keeping them, by watching out for other people, ultimately it will become full circle. If you're, you talked about taking advantage of microloans or whatever, loan sharks, that's not, the Bible talks about not having interest. Why? Because we're supposed to view someone as our brother, right? Meaning, and just like if your brother came to you for a loan, hey, Jeff, could I have $100? It's like, yeah, sure, no problem. I'm happy to give it to you, and just pay me back, when you have a moment. So obviously, where that fits into the big picture of because companies also have to have profit, and I think that's also something. It's an important thing that, I think part of biblical thinking is not that every single person is cut out for every job and we just give and give and give. Meaning socialism is not the ideals of the Bible. I mean, you see that in the stories of within the generation of the flood, that they wanted to have this socialist society. We're going to build a great name for our nation, for ourselves, and we're not going to care about the individual per se. But I definitely, it's definitely something that becomes important to have it within our firms. So you had this with regard to business practices. So, and we talked a little bit about challenges, but what are some of the other challenges that you've seen, again, within the community or within the field of law that you've been exposed to, that you're like, okay, we have to change the way this is working because this is not.
Yeah, that's a great question too. I think at a really high level, What I would say is you kind of led that last bit with basically biblical truth is wisdomful for any application, right? And so we have a saying, all truth is God's truth, and I would start with just taking the biblical principles, that we learn from Scripture and applying them in the marketplace. I think again there is this kind of what we call Sunday Monday divide, right? Or you can say Sabbath and Monday divide. But it's like, hey, what I learn over here in the synagogue, right, or at shul, or what I learn over here in the church is for the church. Or it might be just for relationships. It might be for parenting. It might be for my relationship with my wife, or it might be with my vertical worship of the Lord. And I think what we lose is sort of that horizontal sense of no, like all of that truth needs to be carried over into the marketplace, should be as people of faith, which is why we wrote that book that you mentioned earlier. I wrote that with a guy who founded a tech solutions company called Credera. And the idea was, how do we apply those biblical principles in a marketplace context so that, the business will flourish? And then also, how does all of that tie back to our personal walk with the Lord? And so we can't give what we don't have. And the Bible is not a book of tips and tricks as much as it is about a relationship with God. And so how does that carry over into our horizontal relationships with people, with vendors, with employees, with clients? I mean, all of those things. And so that's when you ask the biggest challenge is helping people connect, what they're learning from Scripture into the marketplace.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit more about the book. Just tell us and in terms of, you wrote it with Matt Levy. I don't know. So what was he able to accomplish within the business? Was it a successful endeavor? How did that work? How did that work? Because sometimes people are like, oh, I tried all these different things, but really it's only if I lie, cheat, and steal, then that's the way that I've found to be successful. But what were you guys able to accomplish?
Yeah, that's good. So he had been thinking about the idea of a book. He founded, again, a tech solutions company here in Dallas years ago that was really, really successful, growing. And a couple of things that are fun about that story, and Matt and I go way back as friends, and so I was tracking with Credera at the time. And, one of the things we were doing on the church side was building this community development corporation and really empowering people through work. So most of the people we were working with didn't want free food and free clothes and free housing. They just they had turned the corner in their lives, and they had come to faith. They were in discipleship, but they also had traditional barriers to employment. And so I had reached out to Matt about the possibility of Credera employing some people that we were working with. In years past, Matt had also reached out about where to invest resources in ministry partners and organizations that were trustworthy. So we had this kind of ongoing dialogue. And then in the marketplace, he had a real heartbeat to coach younger business leaders. And had the idea of, so many coffees that he was having and I were having, frankly, we were having the same conversation. It was pattern recognition, with Christians in the marketplace to go, how do I create a culture that includes these biblical principles and can grow my company and be true to faith in that, and then tie that back to my personal devotion, my personal walk with the Lord. And so Matt was like, I have an idea to write a book, and would you write it with me? And you have business background, you also have ministry background, I have business background, and let's write something together that would be really helpful for the business community. So his idea really was to use it as a tool in those coffees to really slide it across the table to a younger business leader to go, hey, read this, and then let's circle back and talk about it. And so what's been fun with the book is that there have been lots of business leaders who will use that maybe with their leadership team, and they'll invite people to it. I've been invited to come to boardrooms, where they're meeting and they'll do like a 5-week kind of walk through that book, and I'll be there on the front end or on the back end to answer questions around integration or implementation of some of those ideas. And it's just been really fun. And it's been for people of faith or people who don't have faith, but who recognize the wisdom in those principles.
Yeah, there was a book I read a number of years ago called Super Bosses, at how certain people in certain industries are like the people that everything flows down from them. So one of the examples is like Bill Parcells. Like every single winning coach has come through his organization. Again, whatever, 90%, I had some like significant, every player and every coach has been part of that. So it's kind of sharing that as far as with other people. So have there been, I guess, younger secondary businesses that have sprouted up with these principles that you guys have helped to coach?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, part of the Community Development Corporation involves coaching small business owners. And so they do cohorts of like 10 businesses at a time, and they coach them through kind of accelerating their business, or not necessarily incubation, but more acceleration, funding, in-kind donations for website development or photography or things like that. And I believe they've done 30 businesses. The focus has been primarily in the South Dallas area, which is one of our more under-resourced areas of our city. So working with those entrepreneurs has been really terrific. And honestly, from my side, employing and deploying people in the marketplace who do this all throughout the week in a ministry context where they can coach and use those business skills with these entrepreneurs has been really encouraging, on both sides. And so then now that CDC, once those businesses have sort of graduated through that program, there's a little bit of like a Shark Tank, competition at the end where they can pitch ideas, and then people can invest in those companies. There's even a broader version of this in Dallas called the Lion's Den, which is a very similar kind of concept. But what's been also fun is at the end of that journey for these business owners, they've developed kind of like an alumni networking group that continues the conversation beyond. And so that's been really, really fun to see.
Yeah. I mean, I know it was so instrumental when I got started with my business. I sat down with two other business owners, and we had all kind of started around the same time. We were on a similar growth trajectory. And just to sit and talk shop, because, there's you learn none of these things in school. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, sure. Okay. So it used to be, okay, you were an apprentice in your father's shop or your uncle or whatever it was. And then you learned that. And at some point you opened up your own shop, but they don't really have that in today's day and age. And I think that's also something that's missing within our general world, is that kids are not in business with their fathers. So where are they going to learn the application of faith? Where are they going to learn the application of your word is your word? You said it, and you're going to deliver excellence and quality. You said you guys are doing a good job within the church, and that's amazing. But I think that is something where people are not getting that as much. That kind of faith within home and the business. You'll get it at home and you'll get it at the church, but not necessarily, within the business world.
That's right. And, one thing to add on to that is, as a rabbi, when you're thinking about spiritual formation, and you're talking with entrepreneurs, entrepreneurs are probably the loneliest bunch of people in the world, right? They feel like they're on an island and they're rolling up their sleeves. They're working hard to build a bigger business, and many times sacrificing relationships, honestly, to grow something. And so that group particularly can get discouraged pretty fast. And, and I just, and they might go through seasons where the funding isn't there, or the, distribution has been challenging, or the logistics or whatever. And really, as pastors, rabbis, helping them understand how God might be moving and working in that and cultivating them. Right. And so I think about the story even of Joseph, right? From Genesis, where, over the course of many, many years, right, he's given this vision, right, early on as a young man, but it takes years and years and years of being sold and, Potiphar's house, and learning how to run a household, and then being in prison, and then feeling forgotten, right, and going, man, what in the world? Where is God in all of this? And this is nothing like the vision that he gave me, and yet, I've been framed, I've been imprisoned, I've been forgotten. And at the end of that story, what I love so much is that he's standing before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says, hey, I hear you can interpret dreams. And he said, no, not me. God can do that, right? And you've got this two things sort of tracking through that story. One is a heart posture change, right? From this kind of impetuous young man who shares that dream and vision with his brothers, and and then just the softening of his heart through the suffering, frankly, where ultimately he stands and ultimately he's in power, but he's got this posture of humility about him. And so God, how God uses the entrepreneurial journey to shape us, I think is really important. And then secondly, just from a resume and a skills situation, the trajectory of Joseph through those times to learn financial accounting and how to run a household, right? And, all those sorts of things. And then to rise up even in prison to be, in a leadership position there, ultimately gave him the skills that he needed, right, to help lead Egypt through this famine and to be a blessing to the nations, right? So there's just so much to unpack there that I think is so helpful for us in business.
I love that. I've never heard that idea of Joseph as the entrepreneur. I think that is fantastic, and also just that him developing himself at each step, and how does he develop? How does he become? But that is amazing. I do remember there being something at the end of the story where he pushed things too far. That he taxed the people to such an extent that there was kind of nothing left for other people. But I have to go back and take a look at that. Yeah, and Pharaoh was into the dream. Pharaoh is also a leader, and we often think of him very negatively because of the story of Exodus, but this in all likelihood was a different Pharaoh earlier. And when Joseph comes with that interpretation of the dream, why did Pharaoh accept that interpretation? According to Jewish sources, he was given many different interpretations. One, that he would have 7 daughters and that the 7 daughters would die, whatever. And so Pharaoh said, well, I know that my vision is something for the entire world. Meaning if God is speaking to me, he's bringing me a mission, an idea that's got to be something much, much more impactful. And when Joseph comes to say, here's going to be something that is massive, that's going to change the entire world. So then Pharaoh was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. And the other thing that he does is he comes with a solution. And very often people come up, all too often, and this is one of my big pet peeves, is when people in business, a lot of times they come and it's very easy to complain because something is always broken. And to identify something broken is very, very easy. But to come with a solution, much more difficult.
I've got a little phrase I use with my team that it's not a problem unless you have a solution. So yeah, don't come, dump the wastebasket on my desk and go, hey, fix this, but be proactive in solutions. Yeah,
exactly. And you have the story with Jethro also. Right? He comes with the solution, and that is why these stories are so impactful, because very solution oriented, and I think that I wanted just to come back in terms. So you said within the business, within the law firm, you'll speak about kind of principles, kind of big capital P, or biblical principles, but without almost removing them from the Bible, or removing them from a religious context. Is that something because as a respectful thing, or do you think there is a place to bring God kind of back into the boardroom in a more overt type of way?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I hope what you didn't hear is that we remove them from Scripture. I think we are open about our faith as leaders of the firm, but we also respect the fact that people are coming from different faith backgrounds or no faith background, and they want to be part of it. And so we're very explicit about where those values come from, but we also recognize that you don't have to be a believer to care about integrity, to care about excellence. We hope that you're not. I mean, that you do, right? And so we're inviting, if you do have a faith, into conversations, that are more faith-based, but and then also supportive of other passions that people have in the firm. So one of our lawyers here is traveling to Africa next year to be part of a organization that is training lawyers. And man, we're supportive of that, whether there's a faith component or not. There's another lawyer here in this office. I'm in Frisco today. Another lawyer in this office who last weekend was part of a charity gala, and she was excited to include the firm in that. And man, that charity works with at-risk kids to provide mentoring and coaching. It is not faith-based, and yet we were excited to support that and be a visible sponsor of that, because we want to support the efforts of both from a faith perspective and not, as long as they're actually doing impactful work, and we've got a little bit of a rubric, right, that we run them through to assure that we're aligned and we're not doing something against God's word or His will or His purposes. So we're careful in that way.
Yeah, and that is challenging. Sometimes you have, quote unquote charities or nonprofits that definitely do not go with what we would consider an appropriate biblical approach. So that does become challenging when people push you on those kinds of things. So we'll start wrapping up, but I'd love to ask a favorite teaching that you have when it comes to business and faith. I mean, I love what you said about Joseph, but maybe there's another teaching.
Man, gosh, there's just so much there. I think, I think can I go into the New Testament here just a little bit?
Yeah, you wouldn't be a pastor if you didn't.
Okay, so I mean, there's so much that Jesus shared through the parables that I think is really important, for us in the marketplace. One of my favorites is just the parable of the talents, where he tells a story of a master that's leaving, and he gives to his employees different talents, and a talent meaning, a unit of measure that's something valuable, very valuable, right? So to one, he gives 5 talents, to one, he gives 2 talents, and to another one, he gives 1 talent. And then he leaves on this long journey. And so these employees of his really, have been given something of incredible value. So whether you got 1 or 2 or 5, you still got something that you didn't have before, right? That the master has given you to steward, to invest in something bigger than yourself. And so, the story goes, the one with 5 talents invested, and when the master returned, that 5 had turned into 10. And then the servant who had 2 had really, invested in a radical way. I mean, to get a 100% return on your investment, you've got to be doing some really, things. And so the one with 2 talents makes 4. And it was the one with 1 talent that was just worried about, a return on that, and was so fearful that he hid the talent in the ground. And the master said, man, he said to the other 2, well done, right? Good and faithful, not good and business savvy, good and, but just faithful. You were faithful with what I gave you, to invest it. And to the one who hid it, he had some really harsh, rebuke. And he said, man, at least you could have put it in the bank and we could have gotten some, interest on it, but instead you didn't. And I think the point of that story is, that God gives us some amazing things. All of us have the ability to do business, to build relationships, to work, the acumen to do what we do. And so those are all gifts from the Lord. And so how are we using those to invest in things that are going to advance His kingdom, that align with His heart? And so there's just a constant heart check around that for me, and going, man, am I being a faithful steward with what He's given me? Or am I can also find myself kind of, crossing my arms and huffing and puffing a little bit, like, well, look at what He gave that guy. That guy got 5 talents, fill in the blank with whatever. He's better up front with a microphone. He's better with his business. He's got he knows how to read the market, whatever. Instead of comparison, which just kills, of just going, hey, how am I being faithful with what He gave me? And ultimately there'll be, a reckoning for that. Like how do, in fact, it reminds me of this related story of Alfred Nobel. I don't know if you know this story, but, Alfred Nobel, his brother died. And so he opens the paper to read the obituary of his brother, and they actually put the wrong one in. They put his obituary in the paper. And so he's reading how he's going to be remembered, the legacy of Alfred Nobel. And it is all about taking this massive wealth and investing it in dynamite and explosives, which have been used for weapons of war. And he just, he had this, inflection point where he said, man, this is how I'm going to remember it. And I actually have the ability to change this during my lifetime. And he said, everybody should have the opportunity to read their own obituary and have the opportunity to change it. And so, of course, what we now know is the Nobel Peace Prize is him taking that wealth and re-diverting that to something that would bring about peace and prosperity for people. So I think about that often. It's like, what is my legacy? I mean, we're all here for such a short time, 60, 70, 80 years, if you're fortunate enough. And so, this is all a vapor. And so, ultimately, what's the legacy I'm leaving? How am I investing in the things that really, really matter? Am I doing things that are eternally significant, or am I just striving for success at temporal, things that are temporally significant? So it creates a heart check for me every time I think about that parable, particularly.
Wow, I mean that is amazing, and I think that's a great place to wrap things up. Just on that note of really taking the gifts that God has given us and going out to the market, going out to the community, going out. I always ask God, to please allow me to be part of the solution, whatever that solution might be, but take those talents, whatever He's given us. But I can't thank you enough for taking your time, your wisdom, and I'm looking forward to finding some projects that we can work on together to take this to the next level, because I think it's so important to just help people find business and find meaning, and bringing bringing God back into the boardroom, God back into our businesses. So really, thank you so much for your time and your friendship, and looking forward to finding great opportunities to be together.
Well, thank you so much. It's a blessing and a privilege to be with you again. And again, thankful and grateful for the work of Israel 365, and look forward to continuing relationship with you guys.
Amazing. Thank you very much. God bless.
Thank you.